Thanks, Casey. That was great. And without further ado, Sam has come to talk about his journey with GridShare.
Thanks, Louisa, and thanks to Spark and Canterbury Tech and to AWS for sponsoring and facilitating and hosting this event today. Can everyone hear me at the back? Yep, cool. Now, I came here with a few personal goals today, and now I've got another one is hopefully I get more applause than the Yorkshire pudding. Who here had the Yorkshire pudding? Okay, well I have to beat that, all right. Okay, go. Nope. So my name is Sam Kivi. I'm the co-founder and CTO of a company called GridShare. This is a LinkedIn QR code. If you're interested in connecting with me on LinkedIn, feel free to connect now while I talk a little bit about where I've come from. I'll put you all at ease. I am a Cantabrian and born and bred in Canterbury. Spent a little bit of time overseas, but then I came back after university, and I went to university here, and I came back and started working at Inatel. If anyone's heard of Inatel, hands up. Yeah, it's been around for a long time. And so I got my start at Inatel. Inatel's done some really cool things in the telecommunications power space, and leveraged that technology into other areas like battery chargers for forklifts and solar power, solar inverters. So that's where I got my start, was understanding a lot of the opportunities in that space with solar power, how solar power is not really worth anything unless you're using it while it's being produced. For a homeowner who's got solar on their roof, storing it in a battery is quite an expensive thing to do, but using it when you're producing it is really the best thing. And that's, I think, what stuck with me when I left Inatel was the way to get the most out of renewables is to use them and extract the value from those renewables when they are being produced. So what does GridShare do? We build, own and operate energy responsive computing infrastructure. Does anyone have any idea what energy responsive might mean?
Turn stuff on and off at the appropriate time.
Yeah, absolutely right. Turning things on and off, that would be the computing infrastructure in this case. And what we do is we co-locate that computing infrastructure with renewable energy generation sites. So we're not talking about traditional data centers like we have here, enormous, centralized, always built where there is a perfectly developed grid, even redundant supplies coming in to supply the grid, and they never have any downtime. They are absolutely optimized to be up all the time. This is a GridShare data center. Is in construction there, down in Southland next to a hydro dam. That is a small, containerized, modular and portable computing piece of infrastructure. There's some transformers just next to it there. So fundamentally quite different. We're choosing sites to locate these where the grid isn't perfectly stable and isn't perfectly available all the time. We're choosing sites that go offline, that lose power because the provider of power might be a variable renewable supplier. So why are we doing this? We're doing this because there's an opportunity here to leverage this relatively new capability in decarbonisation goals. And if you look at the Boston Consulting Group's report that they released late last year, they essentially came to the conclusion that our best way to reduce the emissions that New Zealand produces is to electrify the processes that produce those emissions as much as we possibly can. And if you look at the report, they quote the Climate Change Commission's analysis of New Zealand's emissions, and that would be 30%, this area up here, is all ripe for conversion away from emissions producing, so the electricity generation is probably coal and gas, for example. The space and heating would be similar. Temp and process, low and medium temperature process heat would be the same, it would be powered by coal and producing emissions. And light to medium vehicles, we know that's just transport, cars and things. So they're all ripe for picking for converting to electrical supply, and therefore mostly renewable at this stage in New Zealand. So one part of the report that that really resonated with me was the potential to decarbonise the broadest energy sector, but that improving equity and lower household energy bills is something that really resonated with us. We really see a future of enabling a lot more renewable energy, and so therefore bringing down the cost of delivering that to the end consumer is super important, and it's one of those goals that Gridshare has. So the digging back into the report, they identified 4 of these main elements that we need to achieve this transition to electrifying these processes. One is we've got to build lots of renewable generation at pace. The other is the dry year problem that we have, where hydro often doesn't have the inflows that we would like, and we rely a lot on hydro to supply our renewable electricity in New Zealand. So flexible generation to meet those odd years where we don't have the hydro we would like. The peak demand problem. The peak demand is when everyone is turning on their electric heaters all at the same time, for example. We need a way to manage that problem so that the grid doesn't collapse under everybody turning on a heater or an air conditioner all at the same time. And the networks, the poles and wires that deliver the electricity, we need them to be flexible, and we need them to be able to hold the capacity that will be at the high demand that will be required as these processes all convert over to electricity. So it sounds expensive, infrastructure is expensive, but renewables, I think you'd all agree, we all hear, have never been cheaper. We hear they're cheaper than fossil fuels. So why haven't we just done away with the Huntly coal power plant? And why aren't we just all sitting on 100% renewables right now? And why aren't batteries the solution to everything? Batteries, I think, have been, at the scale that we're looking at, the scale of this problem that we're trying to address, and the amount of raw materials that's available and the demand elsewhere for lithium-based batteries, the reality is that the cost of building the batteries and sourcing the batteries that we need for this scale of problem, and also the economic model of operating a battery is not fantastic. Pure arbitrage of batteries where we charge them up during the day at enormous scale and then discharging them is not going to solve all of these problems. So the current problem with renewables, why haven't we built all these renewables? So there's a couple of things that we can dig into. The variability of the resource, so wind, solar, the wind isn't always blowing and the sun isn't always shining, same with wave and tidal. They're variable. Those sources, the resources, are not always there when we need them. And that complicates things when you're planning for generation to come onto the grid. Ideally, the wind would blow all the time, very smoothly and stably. That would be the dream for our wind farm operators, but that's just not the reality. The other element is the resources that we have available in New Zealand are immense. We have enormous potential for wind power, but a lot of the resources for wind, for example, are a long way away from the grid, the connecting infrastructure that we need to connect into. So the cost of connecting that resource that might be 100 kilometres away, that connecting infrastructure is cost prohibitive. That'll kill a lot of projects that otherwise have a lot of potential. So the cost of capital, with all of these other risk factors involved in a renewable development system, the cost of the capital has to account for the risk of that project, and so we often find that plays into this as well. Potentially shelving a project just because of the cost of capital. Now, grid supply and demand constraints, we've touched on this a little bit, but when we have coal power plants that provide stability to our grid, particularly in the North Island, if we start phasing those out and phasing in variable renewables that actually cause havoc in the grid by themselves, then we get into a very unstable situation. And we see that a lot in Australia with solar farms. There are huge solar farms that just can't be connected because the challenge of all these solar farms producing solar power all at the same time. So it's quite a dynamic problem. And on the other side, not on the supply side, on the demand side, so the users of the electricity, we have this confluence of society essentially trending to using lots of power in the morning, lots of power in the evening, not much power in the middle of the day because we're all at work, and then a lot less power in the night. And so we've got to solve this problem of variable renewable supply, but also a variable demand. And we essentially now are using coal plants and gas plants, as well as a bit of hydro, to power on to meet those peaks. That's where that real use of coal comes in and produces the emissions that we have in New Zealand. So what about demand response? Has anyone heard of demand response here? Few? Okay. So demand response is very basically turning off something that's using power in order to help everyone else out. It's about lowering that peak. So we might all call around and say in an hour's time, please just turn off all your heaters just for an hour. It won't cool down the room too much, but it'll help our grid get through. That's essentially what we're talking about in demand response. Typically that's applied to...
Quick question, is that what they're implementing in the UK at the moment?
The demand response is very well utilised, actually. I'll cover it here. This is in practice right now in Canterbury. It's all across the world. Demand response is very common practice. This is Orion's network load on a very cold winter's day last year. And what they did is they recognised everyone is going to be turning on their heaters as soon as they get up in the morning. That's the red line potential. What they do is they send out a signal to all your hot water cylinders and tell them all to turn off. How many people knew that? Okay, cool, good. All right, yeah, educating everyone. You're all already there, that's cool. So they can also call on irrigators to turn off. They can also call on, say, supermarkets to turn on their generators, which is not fantastic, but it helps the grid stabilise, it helps the distribution network stabilise. So this happens all the time. This happens every day, actually. They are using this sort of demand response system to reduce the peak loading so that their top line 600 megawatts isn't exceeded and they don't blow a circuit. Okay. So in the big picture, the International Energy Association has determined that our demand response capacity globally needs to grow from about 4 gigawatts up to about 510 gigawatts in order to meet the 2030 net zero targets. That's massive. But it essentially is saying that demand response is a massive, massive part of us accommodating renewables and getting away from carbon emitting sources. So that's where GridShare comes in. We are essentially demand response on steroids. We are purposely bringing an enormous load that is a user of electricity to a location, but then we're turning it off when it's critical to turn it off. It's a bit of a win-win situation here because, as you can imagine, in the middle of the night, a renewable producer of power doesn't actually get much money necessarily for, in some cases, almost zero for that power. So we're buying the power from them for a much better price than zero, I can tell you that. All right? But then when morning comes and they need power for that peak, we turn off. We just shut right off. About 95+% we can shut off all our computing load, and we'll sit for an hour if need be to allow the supply to go through to the grid and meet the need of the grid. And at the same time, this renewable generator is actually making a lot of money. They're doing better because of this, because the price at the peak demand time is higher as well. So everybody is winning in this situation. So this is our, another photo of our site. It's a bit pixely, sorry. Need to get a high-res picture. But this is our site at a hydro dam down in Southland. There's a substation behind, but this is our equipment in the front here. And I want to get into a little bit about the computing that's required to enable this. So what we need is non-time critical computing processes. So the average data center work that we think about that's serving up emails and websites and answering Google queries, that's not what we're doing at all. We are choosing computing tasks that can be paused and then resumed later without affecting the service or the customer at the end of it. And those sorts of tasks are like modeling drug trials, analysing climate and weather forecasting data. Modelling just about anything is becoming increasingly in demand globally, and we think New Zealand can be very well placed to be a provider of green computation power, essentially, utilising this distributed model. So for this site, that kind of computing power, we're looking to develop partnerships. So if anyone is in that high performance computing space, I'd love to talk to you. For this project, we looked a little bit further afield, and what we've actually done is deployed Bitcoin mining computers into these containers. And so what they're doing is consuming a large amount of power, but the Bitcoin mining process does not care if you turn them off and turn them on again half an hour later. It doesn't affect anyone. There's no customer jumping up and down and complaining. We just simply resume service once it's turned back on again. So a little bit more about this site, a few more photos, and we've got a 2 megawatt capacity currently. The electrical infrastructure that we've installed there is actually capable of 3 megawatts, and we'll be expanding our computing container resources there shortly. We can curtail up to 95% or more of the power consumption in less than a minute. And quite exciting to share, just in the last few weeks, we have actually started operating under a demand response agreement, which is the holy grail for us to prove this works, to prove this benefits the renewable generator, and to prove that this benefits the grid. And so you can see, this is just a screenshot of some data we pulled out. The top line is the price for where that substation connects into for the power. So you can see it fluctuates a lot. This is probably a nighttime price, and this is probably sometime in the evening. And the other green line here is our power consumption. So you can see they correlate there. We have turned on to our maximum consumption. Our computing power is doing work all through this low price period, and then as soon as the price shot up, we turned off. And this is all automated. There's no need to get involved. This makes a decision every half an hour about whether it should turn off based on a forecast price. So what's the big picture here? We think that by building out a renewable generation all across New Zealand, with every resource that we can pull in, we can diversify and decentralise the generation that we have in New Zealand. It's currently very centralised, mostly down here in the south, a bit of hydro and geothermal and coal, unfortunately, up in the north. And I think if we can truly overbuild the renewables with this model, we're not constrained by the normal business as usual model for what would allow a renewable site to be built. Then we can shift the role of the existing hydro into providing reserve for when it's not windy and when it's not sunny. And by doing that, we can lower the cost of delivering that renewable electricity to everyone. And the beauty of that is that will catalyse that transition of processes from thermal emissions-based processes over to renewable electricity, simply because it's cheaper. So what else can we do with this? I'll skip through this a little bit because I'm probably running a little bit over time. But there's a few interesting things that we can do with this model in addition to the renewable generation site that I've talked about. Stadiums are an interesting one. They only use their lights about 5% of the time. That's megawatts of power capacity not being utilised. So if we are sitting at a stadium, for example, utilising the capacity of their big electrical connection, but turning off during the rugby game, then they're getting an overall lower cost of delivery of that power, while also getting free space heating from our computer servers. The same goes for EVs in remote locations. I think we can utilise the infrastructure that EV chargers require. And there's an example here of substations that are underutilised. We looked at Orion's substations and identified 11 of them that combined 100 megawatts of unused capacity 90% of the time. And if we went in and utilised that and shut off the other 10% of the time, they wouldn't have any additional peak load on their grid, but they would make a whole lot more revenue. And because they're regulated, those savings would be passed on to the end consumer. We estimate about 5%. That's a bit of a back of the envelope calculation. But these are real tangible ways that we can utilise unused capacity in our electrical infrastructure and have an end benefit for the end consumer. So space heating, I've talked about heating pools and heating agricultural greenhouse. I'll skip over this one. Methane is a really interesting one that we're just starting to look into. If you capture and consume methane that's leaking out of a landfill, you're stopping a gas that is 86 times more powerful than CO2 in warming the atmosphere. And simply capturing it and burning it is a climate positive process. So we're looking to see if we can incentivise capture of landfill gas where it otherwise is just not viable. So this is our team. We're a small company, but we're really excited about the future. We're already pushing into Australia, where there's a lot of really interesting potential in the renewable space over there. And thanks everyone. Thank you for your attention today. And thanks to the sponsors again. Yes.
Does anyone have any
Question.
questions for Sam? Oh, yep. Wow. Hands up quickly on this one. Should we go here?
Are you planning to use legacy hardware? Because I mean, it makes sense. Like if you're only on 70% of the time, to basically grab the old stuff
Absolutely.
out of the old racks.
I love
Everyone
that.
at the back here, the question?
Yep. That's absolutely using. The question is, are we going to use old gear? We already are. We've already bought old second-hand gear. Absolutely, there's some really interesting dynamics in different use cases. So solar, for example, you have this peak, and it's really hard to use just that little peak. But some old gear that's quite cheap can utilise that peak. So absolutely, yep.
How's the reception been from Orion and the likes around this?
Orion has been really supportive. We were actually in the Orion Energy Accelerator program that they sponsored a couple of years ago. And I won't say whether this conversation went anywhere, but we do understand some of what we propose perhaps doesn't have a media-friendly element to it. But we're undeterred. We know what we're doing makes absolute sense. So I just don't. I'm not going to let that hold us up. Yeah, absolutely. The world will come along with us eventually. Yeah.
So, given our size and it's hydro and renewable, does New Zealand have a supply problem and a renewable problem like the larger countries?
No, I think we have an enormous amount of renewable resource. My training and background is in physics, and just walking around, I'm constantly reminded of how much renewable resources around us all the time. It's just not economic to build something to capture it currently because it's too variable or too intermittent. And so this is really what we're addressing, is picking up those resources that weren't on the table as options before.
Great, thanks.
Creating that commercial model.
So is there enough demand for non-time sensitive processing?
For non-time sensitive, I think there is. That is part of the challenge. The reason we didn't bite off the whole chunk of that problem on our first site, I think that there is. It's about corralling those into one place and potentially finding a foundation customer. It might be a university or a research institute who could say, we are behind, we understand what you're doing, we want to be your first customer. We'll work with you to be that first customer that buys that processing, that non-time critical computing. Yeah, absolutely.
Any reason why there isn't as much use of gravity batteries as we might hope to actually store this?
There are some gravity battery technologies taking off in Australia. They're enormous undertakings, enormous capital investment. I'm not one to say that ours is the only solution, and there are no others. Absolutely not. What I'm sort of getting at is that batteries in general don't solve all the problems. They are enormous undertakings, and there's trade-offs with all of them. You could talk about the big battery project proposed at Onslow. That will cost a lot of money. So we're really talking about, we're trying to find a solution that won't cost the taxpayers an enormous sum of money and be a burden on future taxpayers.
So do you see a competitor for this being in essence vehicle to grid, so taking Corey's Polestar and taking some battery out and pumping it back in the opposite direction?
No, I see that as evolving and supporting the local grids more than we're looking to provide in the first instance that supply side of the equation, so building out more renewables. I think we can only be supporting vehicle to grid technologies. There's going to be some amazing things that come out of this. We are tackling things at quite a lot bigger scale than that. Though each of those containers is approximately 1 megawatt, just a little bit under. So that sort of scale is already much larger than what one battery or even a neighbourhood of batteries possibly would provide. They're slightly different solutions to slightly overlapping problems.
Yeah, what's your revenue model, or how do you think you're going to make money out of this in the long term? And also,
interesting
I
question.
did have a second question, which was if you've got a room full of people, what's your ask of us?
Yeah, sure. To answer the first question, we make money from the computing, so whether that's Bitcoin or compute for other services. We make money in selling, when we turn off selling that power, we are sharing some of the upside of selling that power at the time that we turn off. There's also a number of elements here where you can, because of our location in that network infrastructure, we can provide additional services. I actually skipped over the slide, but there's additional grid support services that are available that we are looking at providing, so supporting voltage and frequency that are critical to the grid. So the other part of your question was, what's the ask? We're looking for acknowledgement and awareness that this is a potential solution. It's not really talked about in the wider stage when New Zealand is talking about the solution to the carbon transition. But talking to you all, we are really seeking capital investment. Buying the computers is very capital intensive. We've built our first site and we've reduced the risk of that particular test site, and it's about filling them up and getting the capital to really just move as fast as we possibly can.
Over the far side here. Yep.
Hi.
Hi, you mentioned you're driven by price, so the price signals tell you when to switch off the data center. that's always going to be a lag indicator to the load, right? Because the price will always be a proxy for whatever load there is in the grid.
We operate off forecast price from the WITS electricity pricing system.
So it's pre-programmed. It's not responding in real time to the grid loads.
No, it is not. The pricing that comes out that is predictive, it says what is the next half hour likely to be. We don't control what that price is. The rest of the industry reads the same information and makes decisions on it. So we're operating on the same information that the entire industry is operating on. We can react much quicker than most of those organisations. So they're saying that at 8 o'clock tonight, the price will be X, and then at 8 o'clock we will act on that forecasted information. It might turn out that the price will actually be finalised differently, but that's just a risk that we run.
So you can't really respond in real time, such as to preserve the grid. So there could still be risks of transformer blowouts if there's a...
At the moment, with what we have, yes. One of the key elements of our technology that we want to advance further and further is the ability to respond faster and faster and faster, and there becomes new revenue streams available the faster and faster you can respond, particularly in Australia. If you can respond in less than a second, you are suddenly talking about operating frequency stability services, which gets quite technical. But the faster we can respond, yes, we are essentially helping to balance the grid in real time.
So, how are you planning on getting the data in now? Are you building that?
Sorry?
How are you planning on getting the data in now?
Getting the data in. Yeah, so we have satellite infrastructure. We're not geared up for super high bandwidth fibre. We are choosing sites and processes that are not super high bandwidth requirements. That doesn't mean that will always be the case. Different sites might enable us to offer different services. Good question.
It's more getting the modelling data in.
Yes.
Because the finals are generally quite small. But
yeah, absolutely. Yep. All of these are interesting challenges to solve, but I think we're at an exciting time if ever there was one for getting a lot of data into a remote location. Yeah.
I love it that there's so many questions. I think the only other one was the growing trains from bamboo. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Anyone else got last question? Yeah.
Potentially your biggest competition is, the biggest thing that's going to wipe you out would be if every house, every person basically becomes IoT enabled back to the grid, where like your Nest thermostat automatically turns everything on for you.
Yep.
How do you see that progressing as you're trying to basically increase what you guys are doing?
Yeah, so I think
just the question at the back.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll repeat it. The question is essentially if all of the homes and businesses become IoT connected and are responsive in themselves, does that do us out of a business model? And I think if you looked at the peak loading graph, you're essentially saying that the IoT system of the future would reduce that peak loading down so there wasn't a problem anymore. I think human nature is still going to be present here. I think that's a reality. I don't operate on wishing everyone to be altruistic. I operate on the reality that everyone is selfish, and that's a reality. And I think there's always going to be limitations with that. Yeah.
But I mean, most people at home, it's literally their hot water cylinder. Like mine's on smart timers. 9 o'clock. Free power.
Same. Yeah.
Like
power geek.
Free hot water.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome.
Right, cool.
Oh, join me in giving Sam a really